going to talk about my research, which has been in teamwork and team communication for the last at least decade or so. And when I first started doing this research, I observed 17 student teams as they went through their team projects. And then I interviewed all of the students at the end of their projects and asked them about issues, things that had come up once the projects were in and all the grades were in. I'm going to show you some excerpts from those interviews. And I want to first talk about, I'm going to ask you two questions as we go through these. First, if you have experienced something like this, and second, if you see this problem more as a problem with individuals and personalities, or if you see it more as a problem with coordination, how the team is working together. So here's the first example. I met with a student at the end of his project, and I asked him, did anybody give you input on the report that you wrote? And the student said no. Nobody gave their opinion on anybody's input. And I asked, did you expect them to? And the student said, well, at the beginning, yes. But then at the end, everybody submitted at the last minute. It was rushed, and nobody had time to give feedback on each other's work. How many of you have had a project where you were rushed at the end and nobody had time to really give each other feedback? Okay, all right, at least half of you. Now this problem here, does it seem to be more of a problem with individual personalities? People just not being good actors, not being good teammates? Or is it more of a problem with how the team is coordinating, how they're working together? Team coordination? Okay, yeah, because this is something that could have easily picked an earlier deadline, right? Could solve a lot of this problem. Okay, let's look at the next one. So the student told me at the end of the project, personally I thought we could have used our meeting time better. It took us like 50 minutes to revise half a page because of word choice or what we wanted to say, and then the final deadline cut it. So this is related to the first problem, but a problem of inefficient meetings, not using meeting times very well and letting the deadline sneak up on you. First of all, how many of you have had a problem like that, where you've had an inefficient meeting? Your hand went up very quickly, sir. Inefficient meetings. How many of you? All right, okay, we're seeing like at least 50, 60%. Is this more of a problem, do you think, with individuals and personalities, or more a problem with the team coordinating together? Individuals? Team coordination? Why individuals? And then I'm going to ask you why team coordination.
Well, sometimes it sounds like it was only one or two people that wanted to reply to a certain way. That could be their personality.
Okay, so it could be their personality because they wanted to revise it a particular way. Why coordination?
So I think if there's a person like maybe a team leader or something, and then now okay, let's decide the purpose of this meeting. Yeah, so I think that's one thing.
Okay, so someone says, what's the purpose, or how do we want to proceed?
Yeah.
Things like combination of both, because at individual level, they want to probably take their own lead, and that's like taking the time. But at the same level, time, team coordination as well, because in some they're having a team leader that needs to take the prioritization strategy, maybe to one.
Okay, good. So it can be an issue of personalities. Different people have different ways of doing things. But if the team never had a discussion about how they want to use their meeting time, then it's a team coordination issue. And team coordination issues are lots easier to solve than personality issues. So it's pretty easy to say, oh, we could hold this meeting different, as opposed to, oh, you could change your personality. That's a hard one. All right. Okay, so this has some of both, and most problems do, but it could really be solved with the team coordination problem, or at least it's worth trying that first. Okay, now what about this last one? The student said, so we assigned each person on the team a section of the report, and then she got her teammates' work back. And she was just disappointed. She said it was terrible. I couldn't believe it. My teammates didn't find any work that was engineering related. It was all qualitative data, nothing quantitative. Chance, it was like an exercise in BS, what they presented to you. Those of you who are international students, BS is, initials for a bad word. Alright, so she was very disappointed. So she was disappointed with the quality of work that her teammates submitted. How many of you have had this kind of problem on a team project where you've been disappointed in the quality of work your teammates submitted? Alright, okay, we're getting 60-70%. Alright, it's a common one. You're not blaming any one person. Now, do you guys see how this problem is combined with the first one of being rushed and at the last minute and knows how to get feedback? Can be a recipe for disaster. Alright, so that's something we definitely want to avoid. Now, is this problem more a problem with individuals? She just has some lazy teammates or teammates who aren't very good? Or is it an issue of team coordination? Mm-hmm.
Let's say coordination.
How come?
It sounds like the expectations were shared.
Uh-huh.
There's a about 31 things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe the expectations weren't shared. So again, this could be an issue of both. Maybe they're bad teammates. If they're bad teammates, that's a hard problem to solve. Alright? Or maybe they just weren't clear enough on what the guidelines were. That's a relatively easy problem to solve. And that's what we want to tackle today, is those easier problems with team coordination. Now, if you want to find out more about how to deal with individuals who are just difficult individuals, I'm going to be talking about that next week. Today, I'm going to talk about what are some relatively simple things you could do that could really help teammates communicate together and avoid things like last-minute submissions, inefficient meetings, and poor quality work, or differing expectations. And so we are going to focus on these issues today. And altogether, this will account for pretty close to 70% of the most common team problems. And I'm going to focus on giving you a few techniques for that. Now, before I do, I want to show you, because as part of my research, I didn't interview just students, I also interviewed engineering professionals, people who had been in the workplace a minimum of 5 years. And most of the people I interviewed had like 20 years experience in the workplace. Lots of experience working on teams, most of them had experience managing teams. And so I showed these working professionals some of the situations that students had encountered and asked them what they thought. So here are just a few quotes from them. So one professional said, well, I think the solution to number one is just project management. If you have to turn it in by midnight on Friday, then you should have a plan clearly laid out that says everybody's going to have their part due by Monday. You plan to give feedback on each other's work, and then you roll all of that into the final. So having a plan up front is going to take care of that problem of everything rushed at the last minute. Another professional says defining things up front, defining expectations up front can save you a lot of problems. So in that last quote where the student was disappointed in the quality, if they had had a discussion about expectations, what was required up front, maybe they wouldn't have had that problem in the first place. Maybe they would have, but maybe they wouldn't. So it's a conversation worth having to avoid being disappointed in the quality of somebody's work. Another professional said, it's worth the time to document what you're going to do, to say what we agree on, what our deadlines are, who is going to do what. Off the cuff in business is not a good rule. You should always have a plan and work that plan. And that's really key. Spending time planning. And that is the number one lesson that I want you guys to take away today. And I'm going to show you 4 techniques for doing this. 3 of them are documents that the team produces, and the last one is a role on the team, a person responsible for creating and maintaining these documents. So I'm going to talk about the task schedule, a team charter. So the task schedule lays out deadlines, tasks, responsibilities, holds people accountable to things that they agreed to. Team charter helps the team define expectations, helps the team anticipate potential problems, and talk about them before they become problems, when they're much easier to solve. We're going to talk about meeting minutes. If you have a meeting, you should document what it is you agreed on so that that meeting is effective. And it can help you kind of prioritize what you want to do in that meeting, how you want to run those meetings. And a project manager is a person to kind of help execute the team's decisions. Not the leader, but the person who the team gives the authority to help manage all these documents. Okay. So let me talk first about the task schedule. This is a very simple document. It is, I would say it was common sense, except that I found that the majority of times student teams don't do it. So I guess it's not common sense. Though it might seem like, wow, why would anybody not do that? A task schedule is basically just a list of who is going to do what by when. And let me say, when I was interviewing professionals, I started off, when I first started interviewing them, I asked them, do you use task schedules regularly? And they all said yes. And then I asked them, would you ever do a major project without first creating a task schedule? And they all laughed at me. So I stopped asking that question because everybody did the same thing and I got tired of being laughed at. This is absolutely 100% professional workplace practice. And if you don't do it, maybe you deserve to be laughed at a little bit, all right? It's a small time investment that can have very big payoff. So when you meet with your team, probably in the first team meeting, one of the things you want to do is to break your project up into as many discrete tasks as you can think of. You might not, if it's a big project, you might not know all of the details about the end, but as much as you can, create those big milestones and the subtasks that lead up to them. Next, assign dates to when those need to be in, and assign early dates. So that if something happens to somebody, or something doesn't go as smoothly, or a piece of equipment breaks, you have some time to recover. And then assign those tasks and dates to people. Now, humor me for a second, because you might think this is obvious, but once I started requiring task schedules, I actually had a student team turn in something that looked like this. What's wrong with this task schedule? What's that?
No project manager.
There's no project manager. Something even more fundamental. Yeah, there's no who anywhere. No roles to anybody. There's no names on here. So what's going to happen if this is what you produce? What's the most likely situation? No accountability. All right? You're either going to have one of two things happen. One is that nobody will do these tasks because nobody sees it as their responsibility. Or, if you're lucky, you might have multiple people doing the same task, and then you just have duplication of effort. Both of these are situations you want to avoid. So absolutely, a task schedule needs to have those three key pieces of information: the task, the deadline, and the person. And it doesn't do any good to try to skip on those. Now, as you're doing the task schedule, you should think about different types of collaboration. So one type of collaboration is face-to-face collaboration. We meet together and we talk and we do work together. So a team meeting. And that kind of situation is very good for brainstorming ideas, for suggesting revisions, for coming up with a direction, a vision. It's a very bad environment to actually produce work. It's basically impossible to have more than two people around the computer and to be using everybody's time well. As a matter of fact, most of the teams where students were really angry at their teammates was because they tried to do too much work face to face, and someone would end up getting resentful. And it's also very difficult, as you guys probably realize, to schedule a meeting, to find times when people have availability. I had one student team that we observed, I didn't observe these meetings because they met at midnight, because that was the only time that the teammates had available. And as you can imagine, some of them were pretty mad at their other teammates for picking that time. And I don't think they actually needed to meet to do the work that they needed to do. So really think, is this a task that is good for face-to-face meetings? If it's not, then you might want to divide up the work. And there's two ways to think about dividing up the work. So have people do work individually and submit it to the group. Now one is just to straight up divide it into separate parts. So if we were going to do that, let's say we had a 9-page report. We might say, you do the first 3 pages, you do the next 3, you do the last 3, and then we'll squish them together and turn it in. And that's exactly what those kind of reports look like. They look like 3 different people wrote 3 different things and squished them together. I call them Frankenstein reports, because they don't, the parts don't match. They look like they belong to different bodies. So while that's very efficient, it takes very little time, it also doesn't really involve a lot of collaboration. So a preferable way to think about that is when you have work to do independently, think about it as you're layering parts of the project on top of one another. So that everybody sees, comments, gives feedback, and or makes revisions to everybody else's work. So if you have a 9-page document, someone might write a section, somebody else might make some changes to that and continue on, somebody else would add to that, make additional changes or comments. And slowly the project accumulates, kind of like layers of rock. And this works best if different people on the team have different roles or types of expertise. So if you have someone who's a statistics expert, they always look to make sure that your statistics are really up to par. If you have somebody else who is the client person, maybe they have the most information about the client or the most interaction with the client. They are always looking. If you have somebody else who's a visual design expert, they're always looking at the report through that lens. So if everybody has a little bit different role on the project, a different way they're looking at it, their feedback can really contribute and add to what other people have done. And that's very much how projects work in the workplace, where you typically have people from different departments and everybody has their unique perspective and expertise. So by layering the task like that, where everybody adds and works on everything, you're going to create a more high-quality project because you're going to get more different perspectives and more time for feedback. In order to do this, you need to have a task schedule. And you need to build this into the task schedule. And in the task schedule, you need to plan for revision, review, and comments on each other's work. Plan to review your teammates on day 1. Build that in. So I have seen so many teams. I had one team where a student said, his teammate handed him like a 20-page report and asked, and I asked him at the end of the project, like, did you give her any feedback on it? She'd done the majority of the work. And he said, no, I didn't really give her any feedback. I said, really? In 20 pages, you didn't notice anything you thought should be changed? He said, oh, I noticed some typos and a few grammatical mistakes and things like that, but it didn't seem worth it to bring it up to her. And I was like, wait, you saw typos and grammatical errors and you didn't fix them because it would be socially awkward to do so, because you didn't want to bring it up. You should plan for that on day 1. Heads up, your teammates are going to make errors and have typos. Plan for that on day 1 so that you just do it. You don't have to ask, you don't have to tell anybody, oh, you made a mistake. It's planned for from the very beginning of the project. So you build in these points for review. So, in this task schedule here, one person does interviews, they meet to discuss it, discuss what they're going to do, and then Charlotte takes these interviews and drafts requirements from it. Then Tim emails her comments, and Stephen takes Charlotte's original document and Tim's comments and merges them, revises it, and figures out and maybe adds a little bit more. Then, Tim adds a letter, and then Charlotte revises it again. So everybody is touching every part of it. You want to build in these review points from day one. Here, this is on your handout, is another example of a task schedule with review points built in. You absolutely want that time built in from the very beginning to review, give comments, and then give people time to act on those comments or act on those changes. So, this is my first key point, is to use a task schedule, build in revision points. Now also, when you're reviewing and commenting on each other's work, you should also decide upfront how you're going to do that. And there's two basic ways to do it. The first is direct revision. You make the changes directly on someone's document. So if it's a text document, you might turn on something like track changes in Microsoft Word. Google Docs also has a feature like this. And just go ahead and make any changes, anything you want to change directly. This tends to be very efficient, very fast, but it can be hard for multiple people to give feedback at the same time. Your alternative is to provide comments, provide feedback to the original author or for somebody else. So you would just turn on comments like this and send them back for somebody to integrate the comments. This is really good for big changes, especially if you want to change big content changes, big organizational changes. And it's easier for multiple people to make comments at the same time, but it takes a little bit longer. Both of these are good ways to do it. You can either directly comment on somebody's document directly change somebody's document or somebody's code, or you can make comments on it. Both of them are good. You should just decide up front which one you're going to do. Because what you want to avoid is somebody being surprised and then saying, oh, you made comments. I thought you were just going to change it. Oh, I have another step here I wasn't anticipating. Or, conversely, they might be like, oh my God, you changed my code. I didn't realize. I thought you were going to give me some suggestions and I was going to clean it up. So just tell people up front. Make that decision up front. Both of these are good methods. They have different pros and cons, but as long as you decide up front which one to use, you should be okay. All right, you have this checklist for revising the group document in your handout. Now I'm going to talk about team changes. I talked about task schedules. Absolutely, even a short project. Come up with a short task schedule. It does not take that long. It is well worth the time. It holds people accountable. This gets rid of the majority of slackers on the team, people who don't do their part. Because you have that document there, it's very clear who's responsible for what. If somebody doesn't do their part, you can show that to the instructor and say, look, we documented this was circulated early, and the instructor has the option to do something there. Yes?
Wasn't that listed on the couch scheduling part?
Yeah, that's the task schedule.
So what's the
Oh, I haven't gotten to team charters yet. I was just reviewing what we already talked about. Thank you. Okay, yes, so you're absolutely right. You're absolutely following along. Okay, so I was talking about old information. Now let's go to team charters. Team charter is a document where up front you discuss the group's expectations. Now task schedule I always do. Team charters I do for big projects, but not for smaller, not necessarily for shorter ones, because it might not be worth the time investment. In your handout, you have a document, a sample team charter. What I'd like you to do is maybe take 2 minutes. Now the goal of the team charter, you want to do this in one of your first meetings, and what you want to do is to have a discussion about anything that might hurt the progress of the group. And the idea is that the more information you have up front, the fewer problems are likely to occur later on. So I'd like you guys to go ahead and take a look at the charter in your handout and see what information do you think could be particularly useful for avoiding problems. What could really help the team? What do you think would be, especially based on your own experience, what might have helped previous teams if you had known that time? Who needs a handout? Okay. Sebastian? Thank you. All right, so let me ask you, what information on here, what do you think might be particularly useful in avoiding problems or helping the team respond to problems that might come up later in the project?
Your communication.
Communication and expectations. So the communication etiquette section? All right, good, good. That's a big one because some people, so for instance, I'm on email all the time. Pretty much, and so if someone sends me an email, I often respond within an hour or two. Some other people apparently are not on email all the time. I don't know how they live their lives without being constantly connected, but they can go a day or two without checking their email. If we have these different expectations, that can cause a lot of tension. So just clarifying and deciding what's a reasonable time period to check, how is the team going to communicate and what's a reasonable time frame to check will solve a lot of issues. Good. Yes?
I personally like the missed deadline section. I was really well appreciated.
Missed deadlines. Yeah, these are going to, so if you miss a deadline, these are going to be the consequences. And here's the secret. If you spell out the consequences, you're much less likely to face the issue in the first place. So let me give you an example. I have teenage daughters at home. Last night, yesterday I asked one of my daughters to do the dishes. And then, it was late at night, I came down the kitchen, and I'm like, the dishes weren't done. And she was in bed, and she's like, Mom, oh, I'm tired, I'm gonna go to bed. All right. So she just let her deadline pass. Now, tonight, I sent her a text message, so I have it in writing, first of all. All right, so I sent her a text message, and I said, the dishes need to be done by 6 o'clock when I get home, or else I'm turning off the internet. Now, who thinks that the dishes are gonna be done when I come home? Right? He's spelling out the consequence, you don't have the issue. So, just explaining it, agreeing on that, come up with something you can all agree on, and it's a lot easier to discuss the consequences before they happen than to have to worry, so when my daughter's in bed and she's sleepy and now I have to do consequences and I do want her to get to sleep, and it's just so much more work. This way I just turn off the internet, and that's really easy for me to do as a parent. That's my favorite consequence. So spelling these things out, explaining them. What else might seem really useful on here? Yes?
I really like the part where the students all talked about what their biggest concerns were. Like one of them had a job and he didn't think he could do it, and one wasn't that good at PowerPoint. I thought it was nice that they knew that, maybe work towards their strengths. So PowerPoint, be the one in charge of that part.
Yeah, let other people know where your strengths and weaknesses are, what you're concerned about, and especially if there is a time where, like, you have a week where you have 3 tests, and you're like, I might not be that fitted to the project that week, let people know. They can rearrange deadlines, you can plan for that. Somebody else is gonna have a different week, that's a bad week for them. So make sure that you assign the deadlines accordingly. A lot of these things, if we know up front, or somebody has to give a PowerPoint presentation and they're nervous about it, you can say, oh, well, we'll build in an extra rehearsal for you to do it. A lot of things can be planned for, but only if you know about them. If you don't know that there's a problem lurking there, you won't be able to plan for it. So the more information you have up front, the better off it is. As a teacher, I personally like the personal goals too. I want to know what people want to learn. What are people really motivated to do? we want to make this a learning experience. So if somebody really wants to gain some experience on something, and it doesn't seem like it would hurt the team in any way, why not? Let them build it in so that they can have that opportunity. So the team charter is really a good place, especially for a big, high-stakes project, to spell out the consequences, to spell out how exactly the team is going to interact together, things like communication etiquette, to figure out what are some obstacles that might happen in the future, and how can we plan for them up front. It's also a good idea, hopefully you all agree on what the criteria are, in which case it should be very simple. But if you don't agree on what the criteria are, you absolutely want to do that. That's gonna help you avoid the issue of somebody handing in poor quality work. Because if people have different ideas about what the goal is, what the criteria is, then they're gonna have really different perceptions. Somebody's gonna do some work and somebody else is gonna say, oh, that's not what I was expecting. That's not what I thought this would look like. So the more that you can clarify those up front, the better off you are. So that's the team charter. Something that you do up front to kind of document expectations. Are there any questions about that before I move on? Yes?
I have kind of a scenario question. So, in this case, it seems like potentially each person was graded individually or something, where one of them was willing to accept a lower grade, and then that would not affect the others. Sometimes you don't have that. Like sometimes the group is graded as a whole, and the instructor doesn't really. I'm not saying here, but just in general, like the instructor or the person who is like higher up, then you might not really care either way. If someone's not doing the work, as long as the work gets done. So how would you handle that situation?
That's a harder situation to handle. So if there's not an individual grade. Now in the workplace, there pretty much is, because if somebody doesn't show up for their work, they're not going to be working there very long. So it can be a little bit clearer. What you could do instead is say, well, we're just going to document that and hand that in along with the project. We're just going to hand in a memo saying who did what, and make that clear to the instructor. Whether or not, if the instructor doesn't care, there's not a lot you can do. Okay? But still, let's say somebody is not willing to do as much work as everybody else. Then you want to make sure, say somebody's willing to do 80%. So sometimes when I have students on projects, some students will be like, I will do anything, professor, to get an A. I will wash your car, feed the cats, I'll do anything. And then there might be another student who might be like, yeah, I'm graduating this semester, I already have my dream job, I don't really care that much about my grade. So, that's not an ideal situation, but if you know that somebody's less committed up front, wouldn't that affect what task you assign them? Yeah. So again, the more information you have, and giving a safe environment for somebody to say, I'm not as committed as other people on the team, can really help you plan for that eventuality. Okay, so great question. Any other questions before I move on?
We might have touched on this, but in terms of, we're in this workshop, not everybody at the university is here, so we know how to do this now. Would you suggest that we do, if nobody's taking, initiative, we jump in and start planning the meetings with them?
Yes, I do suggest that you take initiative. I suggest that you provide a rationale. If you just start doing this, people might say, oh, it's a waste of time. Workshop with an expert on teamwork, who has a best-selling book on teamwork, and this was the recommendation, and here's why it will save us time in the end. Can be one way. We also do workshops and classes, so you could ask your professor, like, I've been to this workshop and I think it'd be really helpful if we did this in the whole class. And either I or one of my assistants can come and do it in the class, and that takes care of that problem. Good. Let's talk about meeting minutes here. So when you have a meeting, and I already talked about that, meetings are expensive. To have a face-to-face meeting, that's a lot of resources. You're using everybody. If you have a big team, that's a very expensive resource. I've gone around in teams in the workplace, especially when it was a really bad meeting, and estimated the salaries of everybody. So they're like, okay, we're spending $10,000 on this meeting. And I don't think it's quite worth that. So meetings, really make sure that you need the meetings, and if you need to have a meeting, make sure you take the time to document what was decided. Otherwise, that meeting is not gonna have its benefit. You're gonna end up most likely having the same discussion again. So this is from the CEO of Intel, who says, if the meeting was worth calling in the first place, then the effort to produce and distribute, which is send out the minutes, is a small additional investment to get the full reward of that meeting. Here's another engineering professional that I interviewed that said, you can say one thing to 5 people, and they might hear 5 different things. So you need the documentation of the meeting so someone can say, oh, that's not what I heard. That's not what I decided on. And even if you don't produce formal minutes, you should still have a page, a bulleted list that says who is going to do what. Anybody volunteered for anything in a meeting, you need to make sure that's documented. Now, I realized when I first started assigning teams and telling them to produce minutes, that students often didn't have a good sense of what good meeting minutes are. So what I'd like you guys to do is in your handout, there are 3 different versions of minutes for the same meeting. I'd like you to take a couple minutes and figure out which version you like best, which is best for the team to keep track of itself, and then I'm going to ask you guys to vote, and we'll talk about why. So I want to know what you like, version 1, 2, or 3, and why. All right, let's see a show of hands. Who likes version 1 the best? You make sure you get one down there. All right, nobody ever likes version 1. Version 2, who likes this the best? All right, okay, we have a very strong favor in this. What about version 3? Anybody want to? I usually have 1 or 2 people vote for version 3. Let's go through these one by one. So version 1, why does nobody like this? What's wrong with that? Yes?
When I just started with the first person and I saw the text, I didn't really know my eyes.
Yeah, you don't want to read it. All right, so I have a PhD in English and literature. I don't want to read that. All right, so if you have somebody who's in the more technical field, yeah, nobody wants to read all of that. Good. What else? What else?
It doesn't have a subject like what is the meaning for and it's not bulleted like.
Yeah, it's not bulleted. It's hard. You can't skim it. It's hard to find information. Yeah.
Even if it contains more important information as compared to similar version, it will be
Right. So first of all, people won't read this, so it's ineffective just because of that, because it looks too hard to read. All right, but also, so this is a data dump of everything that happened in the meeting, just sort of a chronological transcript of what happened. And when I have seen people produce minutes like this, I've been like, gosh, that meeting was horrible enough the first time. Why are you making me relive it in every single moment? That's not the purpose of meeting minutes. All right, so this is clearly too much detail, not enough prioritization. So version 2, this is the one you guys like. What do you like about this? Why is this good? Yes?
It has headers, so you kind of know what each section is going to be talking about.
Okay, good. So you can kind of skim and find the section that's most relevant to you. Good. Yes?
you know what after the time you mean what
Yeah, this to-do list. It's really easy. So if I'm Karen, I can skim it and see, okay, that's what I have to do. Always produce that at a minimum. Always produce that to-do list.
even if some section will have been left out, and this is really important to do what came out of the meeting and what needs to be done.
Yeah. What came out of the meeting, what needs to be done. All right, so if I'm the person who's responsible to read it, to revise the research review, this gives me a list of what needs to happen. It reminds me of all the changes that I need to make.
A person does not need to read everything just
Yeah.
out of the meeting. You can just see the to-do like.
Uh-huh.
What to do. And when's the next meeting as well.
When's the next meeting? All right, so what about the last one? You guys didn't like this as much. I think it's still better than the first one. But what's wrong with this? Why is this not good?
Not organized properly. actual data is there and it's printed out, but probably we haven't put up in the section.
Alright, so it's not organized by topic, by sections. What else?
For the third version, I have to read every paragraph to know what they talk about. For the second version, I just see the topic, the several last words, I know who is talking about.
Yeah, so it's harder to skim this. And this is very focused on the past. Who did what? Karen said this. Jason moved this. Now there's a place for these kind of minutes. I call them parliamentary minutes. So if you were ever at a public meeting, at a meeting where politicians were present, you might document in this kind of style to say who said what, who did what exactly happened. Because if you have a politician in your meeting, they want it documented that they spoke. Now for a project team, for your own team, it doesn't matter who said it or who came up with it first. As a matter of fact, if you're on a really good team, you might not even be able to remember who said it first. It's just like, oh, we all came up with that idea at the same time. This is very focused on the past. When you guys were talking about this, you said it's what needs to happen. The purpose of meeting minutes is not to document the past. It's to regulate the future. To say what needs to happen. To project the future. And this is why when you go into the workplace, a lot of times students think that a secretary might be the person who would produce the minutes, and that's very rarely the case. A lot of times the secretary doesn't have the knowledge that is necessary to produce the minutes. It's usually the person who has the most investment in the project, and that project being done. So it's usually the project manager who will produce the minutes, because they are really concerned with everything getting done on time and making sure that this information is correct. Let me give you a story. So I was a computer programmer for a number of years before I went back to graduate school. And I was on a big project where we were working on revising our computing system. And I eventually kind of took over the minutes because the person who was leading the meetings was just doing a bad job. And we'd have a meeting, and we wouldn't produce minutes, and so the next meeting we'd have the same discussion. And then the next meeting we'd basically talk about the same things. They're like, this will kill me if I stay on this project. So I started producing the minutes. Now one time, we had this meeting, and people were arguing, it was very contentious about what we wanted to do, and eventually, it got to be like 4:30, 5 o'clock, and people had to leave. And so people just started walking out. They're like, I have to go home. And so the meeting just kind of ended, and we didn't make a decision on this issue. Now, I was writing the minutes, and I'm telling you this not because I recommend you doing this, but to just show you how powerful meeting minutes can be. So I was doing the minutes. I was really, really sure about what needed to happen. I was really certain about the decisions that needed to be made. So as I was doing the minutes, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to have another meeting where we talk about this issue when I'm sure this is what we were going to end up. So I went ahead and I put in the meeting minutes that we had made that decision. And knowing full well that we had not actually made that decision. Now, I'm not advocating that you do this, but I put that in there. And I thought, well, if anybody calls me on it, if anybody says, no, that's not what we decided, I'll just say, oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood, and issue a retraction. So I went and I did that, and I emailed the minutes out. And then I sat by my computer, really nervous, waiting for replies to come. And I got lots of replies. And they all said, wow, that meeting is so much more productive than I remember. We got so much more done. All right, nobody called me on it, and then the next meeting we were able to start and move along, and I saved us a full meeting, I think, by doing that. Now, not advocating lying on purpose, but that just shows you how powerful they are in regulating the future, in pushing the project along. So having meeting minutes that really document these decisions will help make your meetings more effective, will make sure that the time you spend in those meetings has the payoff. That the decisions you made actually get done. All the time in student meetings, I would hear these great, fantastic ideas, And then and I was recording all these, so I'd ask students at the end of the project, oh, what happened to that idea? Like, oh yeah, that was a good idea, yeah, that just kind of got dropped. If you put it in the minutes, then it's there for the team to return to. All right, so what I've talked about so far, 3 different kinds of documents. I'm going to talk about a project manager, which is a person who is largely responsible for maintaining these documents. Team needs to assign a person who they give the authority to implement the team's decisions. So the project manager is not the person who makes the decisions. They enforce the decisions that the team has made. And the project manager primarily does this through documentation. So they do this, they might email people about deadlines, especially if the team decided up front that people would like reminders. They update the task schedules. So as a project changes, maybe something, a milestone has changed, the project manager would update the task schedule. They would circulate the meeting minutes. Before a meeting, they would provide an agenda. I haven't talked about that, but an agenda can be very simple. It's just a bulleted list of what needs to be discussed in the meeting. Make sure that you need to have that meeting, that you actually have things that are worth discussing that week. And if the team has problems, as you guys saw in the team charter, having a project manager who would enforce the team's decisions if someone misses a deadline or turns in bad quality work, or does something where you have to notify the instructor. So the project manager is the person who is primarily responsible for keeping these tasks, keeping the team on track. Now, on a project that's probably not the only work that person would do unless it's a very large team, but it would be a responsibility that you would assign to a person to make sure that all of the things that the team decided that there's some accountability for. All right, so these are my main points here. We have 5 minutes left. Let me hear what questions you guys have. Yes?
How early in advance do you send the agenda, and how late after the meeting?
Usually a couple days, 2 days before the meeting. You might want to talk about that in the up in the team charter too. When would people like the agenda? It can be okay. It's still not too late even to send it the same day, so people know in advance what you're going to talk about. Good.
I have a question which might be beyond this, but how do you kind of manage the team manager sometimes? 'Cause
All right, I get that a lot. Yeah.
They tend to go crazy with projects from time to time, and then, with meetings, not projects. And then you have just all these meetings and you have no time to get your work done. So how would you deal with that?
Oh, so if you're the project manager, how do you manage your time?
No, if
No.
you're someone on the team, but you're not the project manager, and the project manager is called for way too many meetings that you think
Okay, so the project manager isn't doing a good job. All right, so it's a tricky situation. All right, so if the project manager's not doing a good job, one thing that you can do is suggest, like, hey, would you like me to take over that task? You seem kind of busy. Can I help you out? Because somebody needs to do it and step up to the plate. That's a pretty friendly way of doing that. Now, if the person still was like, no, I don't want to give up control, then you might want to talk to the other team members, see if they feel that way, and discuss as a team and kind of come up with a consensus with the rest of the team. Hopefully it won't come to that, and most of the time, if the project manager's duties are pretty well laid out, it doesn't happen too much. But it could potentially happen. Okay. Yes?
Are there, in addition to the project manager, are there other key roles that we see coming up in groups?
So the project manager is absolute essential. Otherwise, you need to assign the roles based on the task at hand and the type of project. So some projects require somebody with design expertise, and so the timing might depend on what they're able to do. It really depends on the project, and for different projects, you might need different kinds of expertise. Good.
I have a question.
Yes.
Like, for the time schedule, how do you decide every deadline properly that you could really manage the time?
How do you decide them properly? So always default to an earlier deadline than you think you need. Alright? Because the consequences of doing something early are not nearly as bad as the consequences of doing something late. Right? So put things early. Now there are gonna be some deadlines, some things you just don't know. So you update the task schedule. So, for instance, sometimes some work needs to be done and a part needs to be done before you can figure out the next part. So once you get to that point where you're able to make decisions, have a meeting, discuss the next set of deadlines. But it needs to be as best as you can estimate, and that way if something takes longer. If you put an early deadline on it, it should be like, okay, not a big deal if we need a couple extra days. Good. Yes?
Can I suggest something?
Sure.
So when I worked on teams, not here, but at work, like, I think the time when it's, like, worked out the best for us is when the task manager said, let's go around, you guys all know what you're gonna do, how long do you think each of these tasks are gonna take you? And then you're kind of responsible for managing your own time, but they also are up to date with when you think you're gonna be done with that. So it's a little bit easier on everyone.
So each person gives their own estimate, but they keep the rest of the team updated in case that needs to change. Alright? But always go with maybe a little bit earlier.
I was gonna ask, if the team is not randomly assigned by the professor, for example, what tips do you have for how to select team members or how to communicate to even get on a team?
Oh, that's a good question. So how do you decide, who to team up with? That's hard if you don't know the people in the class. Yeah. So what I might do is I might say what my expertise was, or what I'm really hoping to do on the project, and see if there's somebody else who has complementary expertise to work with. A lot of times you get to know a few people in your program, and I pretty much always go with the person who's really motivated and eager to learn over the person who might be more experienced. Because the motivated person, I just find I get more energy from working with them, and a lot of times the person who says they have expertise maybe doesn't have as much expertise as they think they do. All right, good. Good.
Not only from the parent perspective, but also if you look from the university perspective on somebody who has business. So how can you do upon that? Okay, you can take the meeting, but sometimes you can help in collecting all the concepts that were shared during the lessons for this particular class. I think half an hour is
So is your question, how do you take notes and then participate fully in the meeting? Yeah, okay. All right, there's a couple ways of doing that. I usually don't have a problem. I bring my computer in and I'm just writing down what people say. Sometimes what I will do is I'll project my notes up here, and then if I have something I want to say, I'll just write it up on the screen and kind of bold it, and wait for the rest of the team. So I kind of like it because it becomes a way I can kind of control the conversation while also doing something useful for the team. So I find it is possible to do both, because what you're really focusing on, you don't need to take down every detail, right? You need to take down the decisions. And it's also really good, when I have big meetings, I'll be like, okay, and the topic changes, I'll be like, wait, I'm taking the minutes, what did we decide? I'm not sure, is this what we decided? So it becomes a really good way to sort of help manage the meeting and make sure that everybody heard the decision and that you actually came to a decision, as opposed to just, it felt like a decision, but nobody actually said it. Okay. Yes?
What if counting topic, there's still no,
What if there's no decision?
yeah.
Well, then you kind of need a decision, or you need to make a plan. How are we going to get to that decision? So if there's not a decision made, all right, why did you not make, so that needs to be clear. We haven't actually decided anything. All right, usually you need more information in that case. So we need to figure out what's stopping this information, the decision. And then make a plan to address that. What can you move towards it? Is that not your question? Okay. Okay, all right, good. we're at the end of the hour, so why don't I let you go, but if you have other questions, I'm happy to stand around and, talk to you guys.